A sterile plastic tube fills with saliva. A harmless holiday gift. A quest to find out if you are 20% Irish or Scandinavian. Then, a hard cut. A SWAT team breaches a door at 3 a.m. Boots shatter glass. A bewildered suspect is slammed against the hood of a cruiser. Here's the paradox. The person in handcuffs never took a DNA test. You probably think your genetic code belongs to you. You refused to spit in the tube. You guarded your biological data, convinced that avoiding commercial kits keeps you securely off the grid. You are completely wrong. Because of the inescapable mathematics of human reproduction, you are already locked inside the system. Your privacy was quietly surrendered by a third cousin you have never even met. We are going to dissect the exact mathematical exploit that allowed investigators to bypass the Fourth Amendment of the United States Constitution. We will look at how a perfectly legal, open-source hobby website was weaponized into the ultimate surveillance dragnet, a digital trap that turned the entire American population into a perpetual, searchable lineup. Sacramento, California. The air in the evidence room is dry, smelling of degrading cardboard and chemical preservatives. A technician pulls a battered box from a high shelf. Inside rests a tiny vial containing a preserved semen swab from a 1970s crime scene. To the forensic genealogist staring at this vial, the room fades away. This is not just physical evidence. It is a ghost locked in glass. For over 40 years, one of the most prolific serial predators in American history remained an absolute phantom. He terrorized neighborhoods, leaving behind a trail of shattered lives and pristine biological evidence, but absolutely no identity. He existed merely as a collection of crime scene reports and a behavioral profile that led investigators precisely nowhere. The official narrative tells you that DNA is the ultimate weapon against crime. You have been conditioned by decades of television to believe that a single drop of blood instantly equals a name and an address. But the reality of genetic forensics is far more primitive and bureaucratic. The investigator knows that biological evidence is completely useless without an existing context. Enter the FBI's Combined DNA Index System, universally known as CODIS. This is the vaunted database law enforcement relies on. But CODIS is incredibly myopic. It does not read your entire genetic blueprint. It only looks at 20 core loci. These are short, repeating segments of junk DNA. They reveal absolutely nothing about your eye color, your heritage, or the shape of your face. Think of those 20 loci as a highly specific barcode. A barcode only works if the scanner already recognizes the product. The forensic genealogist stares at the pristine barcode extracted from the Sacramento vial, fully aware of the system's fatal flaw. If the suspect has never been arrested for a prior felony, their barcode is simply not in the system. When the technician runs that 1970s DNA profile through the federal database, the supercomputer does its sorting, checking millions of convicted offenders, and then it returns absolute zero. No match, no partial hits. The trail goes completely, terrifyingly cold. The ghost remains untethered to a name, protected by his own lack of a criminal record. This is the paradox of traditional police work. You can hold the literal building blocks of a killer's identity in your hands, yet remain completely blind to who they are. The investigator sits in the windowless lab, bathed in the harsh blue light of dual monitors, exhausted by the fundamental limits of the justice system. The law requires a precedent that simply does not exist. By the year 2018, detectives had exhausted every traditional avenue available to modern law enforcement. They had thousands of pages of case files, thousands of hours of interviews, and a perfectly preserved genetic profile. Yet, they were staring at a brick wall. They had the biological signature of a monster, with absolutely zero data to compare it against. You see the anomaly here. The corpse of the investigation was lying on the table, dead not from a lack of evidence, but from a lack of a matching database. The old rules of criminal justice dictated that if the killer was not in CODIS, he would die an old, free man. The official channels had failed. To catch a phantom, you have to break the established rules of the game. When the front door of the legal system is bolted shut, desperation forces you to look for a back door. The forensic genealogist realizes that relying on the FBI's archaic 20 loci system is a guaranteed defeat. The solution is not going to come from a meticulously regulated police laboratory. It has to come from somewhere entirely unregulated, wild, and exponentially more powerful. The investigator shifts their gaze from the government database to the open internet. Out there, millions of ordinary people are voluntarily mapping their entire genomes, uploading their deepest biological secrets to public servers. They are unknowingly building a surveillance network that the federal government could never legally construct. And they are doing it for fun. The traditional police DNA database only works if the criminal has been caught before, neatly cataloged by the state. But what do you do when the ghost has never been fingerprinted? How do you hunt a man invisible to the government? You stop looking for his criminal record, and you start exploiting the genetic vanity of his distant relatives. The trap is already set. We left the government detectives staring at a ghost, completely blind to the fact that their salvation was already growing on the open internet. I want you to observe a sterile, brightly lit commercial laboratory. Watch the robotic pipettes flawlessly dispensing reagents into hundreds of tiny wells on a microplate. This is not a police facility. This is the physical manifestation of consumer curiosity being processed on a terrifying industrial scale. Your high school civics textbook told you that law enforcement always possesses the ultimate technology, the most advanced forensic tools available. They lied to you. The official narrative of the omnipotent police state is a myth. The most powerful, high-resolution genetic tracking system ever devised was not built by the FBI in a bunker. It was built by corporations selling you a colorful pie chart of your heritage on a smartphone screen. The anomaly here is the sheer scale of the technological mismatch. The FBI's archaic system relied on that meager baseline of 20 genetic markers to identify a suspect. It was a digital flip phone in the era of quantum computing. While the police were squinting at those 20 data points, commercial genomics companies were simultaneously analyzing over 600,000 single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs. To understand this weapon, you have to understand the code. These SNPs are the microscopic variations, the tiny typos in your genetic manuscript. They are the specific lines of biological code that dictate your eye color, your hidden medical predispositions, and the exact ancestral valleys your forebears walked out of. Analyzing 600,000 of them does not just identify you, it mathematically reconstructs you. The absolute genius of this surveillance dragnet is how willingly you participated in its creation. No totalitarian regime forced anyone to submit to a mandatory DNA swab. Instead, by the mid-2000s, millions of Americans were happily paying around $99 for the privilege of handing over their entire biological blueprint. You paid the corporation to index your fundamental biological existence. Think about the psychology of that transaction. You thought you were purchasing a fun conversation starter for the Thanksgiving table, a neat little graphic telling you that you are 40% Irish. You were actually funding a private intelligence apparatus. The product you bought was a comforting illusion. In the cold mathematics of big data, the pie chart is merely the bait. The actual product has always been you. This created a massive, crippling asymmetry for the detectives hunting the Golden State Killer. On one side, the police held the murderer's pristine DNA, but were trapped inside a governmental database that resembled a ghost town. On the other side, private corporations held a phenomenal, unprecedented map of humanity, but flatly refused to grant police access, hiding behind ironclad terms of service and user agreements. Look at the absurdity of this legal standoff. Law enforcement is permanently handcuffed by the Fourth Amendment and their own outdated technology. Meanwhile, Silicon Valley executives sit on a goldmine of forensic evidence, legally bound to protect the identities of millions of consumers. It is a locked safe containing the exact answers the detectives desperately need, suspended just out of their legal reach. Inside these commercial labs, the robotic hum of the pipettes never stops. Every single day, thousands of new saliva samples arrive in the mail. Every single drop expands the interconnected grid of human heritage. Every $99 credit card swipe tightens the invisible net. The database is a living, breathing entity, feeding on human vanity and growing exponentially more precise with every voluntary upload. When you extract 600,000 genetic variables from a single person, you break the boundaries of individual privacy entirely. You are no longer just identifying the person who spit into the plastic tube. You are suddenly mapping their entire bloodline. You are charting a vast, inescapable constellation of distant cousins, aunts, and uncles who never consented to be part of any corporate tracking database. The corporate attorneys swore that this ecosystem was completely contained. The terms of service promised you that your genetic secrets would remain sealed within their private servers, far away from the prying eyes of government investigators. Legally speaking, their front door was a fortress. You were perfectly safe, as long as the data remained securely locked inside their proprietary, strictly regulated walled garden. But I've tracked enough anomalies to know that you never attack a heavily guarded fortress from the front. If the multi-billion-dollar corporations refuse to play ball, you do not waste your time fighting their army of lawyers in federal court. Instead, you look for the blind spot. You look for the specific vulnerability where this highly sensitive data freely bleeds out of the secure commercial ecosystem. The police were blind, and the tech giants were entirely uncooperative. Yet, the trap waiting for the Golden State Killer was about to spring wide open. The true architects of this biological dragnet were not the federal agents, nor were they the Silicon Valley CEOs. The architects were the very consumers themselves, completely unaware of the massive backdoor they were leaving wide open on the Internet. The corporate firewall was a masterpiece of legal engineering, completely impenetrable to any federal warrant. You probably assumed this meant the biological data of millions of Americans was safe, locked away in a pristine Silicon Valley server. You were profoundly wrong. The fatal breach did not come from a highly sophisticated, state-sponsored cyber attack. It came from a messy living room in Florida, right in the dead of night. Look at this glowing laptop screen, illuminating a cluttered desk in a quiet suburb. A retired hobbyist sits here, casually bypassing billion-dollar security infrastructure. They are not writing complex, malicious code. They are simply uploading a raw text file to a crude, early internet-style website.
The screen reflects rows upon rows of plain text and numbers. This is the raw source code of human life, stripped of all its corporate encryption.
To the forensic genealogist, this pixelated interface represents an absolute paradox. How exactly do you search a massive corporate database that legally forbids you from searching it? The simple answer is that you do not even try. You look for the massive, glaring backdoor that the users happily built for themselves. You exploit the human desire to connect, which always outpaces the rational instinct to protect. The official narrative tells you that data privacy is controlled by brilliant tech CEOs. That is a complete myth. Frustrated by their inability to compare family trees across competing commercial platforms, amateur genealogy enthusiasts decided to take matters into their own hands. They created a Wild West workaround called GEDmatch. It was an open-source, public platform built on sheer curiosity, entirely outside the jurisdiction of corporate lawyers. The mechanism was brilliantly simple and entirely unregulated. Users would request a download of their raw genetic files from the highly secure commercial sites. Once that file hit their personal hard drive, the corporate privacy protections instantly vanished. They would then voluntarily upload this naked biological data directly to GEDmatch, hoping to find a third cousin or a lost biological parent across different testing services. You have been conditioned to fear the dark web and anonymous hackers stealing your identity. Yet here, everyday people were willingly taking the most intimate blueprint of their existence and posting it on a public bulletin board. I look at this system and realize a terrifying truth. The fortress was never breached from the outside by a malicious actor. The gates were simply pushed wide open from within by curious consumers. This open-source paradise had virtually zero security protocols. There were no two-factor authentications guarding your genetic identity. GEDmatch operated under a remarkably loose terms of service agreement written by hobbyists rather than corporate legal teams. Crucially, anyone on Earth could upload any genetic file they possessed, and they could do it under a completely fabricated alias. It was the perfect digital blind spot. In a windowless cold case lab, a realization strikes the investigator with the force of a physical blow. The rigid rules of the criminal justice system simply do not apply to this chaotic digital frontier. If a retired school teacher can upload a genetic profile under a fake name to find a distant relative, a police officer can absolutely do the exact same thing to hunt down a phantom. The legal loophole is terrifyingly wide. You might argue that the police cannot just seize your genetic code without a federal warrant, but you are ignoring the fundamental nature of the Internet. Once data is voluntarily published on an open-source platform, the constitutional expectation of privacy evaporates. Law enforcement did not need to break down the reinforced door of a Silicon Valley tech giant. They just needed to register a free account on a website built by amateurs. By the spring of 2018, the desperation of the Golden State Killer investigation reached a breaking point. An investigator took the murderer's frozen biological legacy, preserved from a 1970s crime scene, and sent it to a specialized lab. They did not ask for a standard police analysis. They ordered the lab to read the DNA exactly like a consumer test, extracting those 600,000 variables. The resulting data file was indistinguishable from the biological profile of a curious consumer looking for their ancestral roots. The investigator sat down at a computer, navigated to the crude GEDmatch interface, and uploaded the serial killer's genetic sequence. They did not use an official FBI credential. They used a generic email address and a completely fake name, dropping the ultimate predator into a sea of hobbyists. Think about the profound absurdity of this moment. A ghost who had terrorized a state, who had evaded the most sophisticated law enforcement agencies on the planet for 4 decades, was suddenly just another anonymous user on a genealogy forum. The investigator clicks submit, and the raw text file begins to process. The digital bait is cast into a database containing the voluntary submissions of over 1 million ordinary Americans. Inside the cold case lab, the dual monitors reflect the stark blue glow of a loading screen. The investigator is not waiting for a fingerprint match or a license plate ping. They are waiting for the ruthless mathematics of human reproduction to do the heavy lifting. The open-source algorithm is rapidly comparing the killer's 600,000 genetic markers against every single person who ever uploaded a file to that server. You assume that because the killer never took a consumer DNA test, the screen will return a massive error. You are applying the logic of the 20th century to a 21st century nightmare. The system does not need the target to be present. The screen refreshes. It does not flash the name of the Golden State Killer. Instead, it generates a long, cascading list of ordinary people. The digital trap has successfully closed. The investigator stares at the endless rows of aliases and contact emails. These are not suspects. They are the target's distant relatives, individuals who unknowingly carried fragments of the killer's biological code in their own veins. By bypassing the corporate firewalls and exploiting the open internet, the police did not find their man. They found his entire extended family, and the biological hunt was officially underway. The upload did not return a flawless one-to-one mirror of the killer. It returned something far more insidious. A sprawling, chaotic list of third and fourth cousins. You have been taught that a genetic match is a binary event. Either you are in the database or you are a ghost. You were completely wrong. That high school biology logic fails to grasp the terrifying geometry of human reproduction. A direct hit is not required to destroy your anonymity. Look at the architecture of this digital dragnet. It is not a filing cabinet. It is a continuously expanding web of glowing nodes against a black void. You stubbornly believe that hoarding your own DNA protects you from the state. You refuse the mail-in kits, feeling secure in your isolation. But mathematics is utterly indifferent to your paranoia. You are exactly as invisible as your most gullible, curious relative, and you have thousands of them. To understand your exposure, we must observe how forensic genealogists actually weaponize biology. They do not look for identical clones. They hunt for identity by descent. This is the exact measurement of physical DNA segments shared across generations, calculated in units called centimorgans. Think of a centimorgan not as a biological trait, but as a unit of time, a microscopic tape measure recording exactly how many generations separate you from a stranger. When the investigator's screen populated with those distant cousins, it was not a dead end. It was the mathematical equivalent of establishing an inescapable perimeter. If you share 50 centimorgans with a user in this database, the investigator knows exactly where the ancestral lines intersect. You are tethered to a shared great-great-grandparent. The killer was no longer floating in a void. He was pinned to a highly specific branch of the human family tree. Here is the procedural nightmare that officially broke your illusion of privacy. The detective does not guess who the suspect is. They simply construct the family tree backward to those mutual great-great-grandparents, a purely clerical task using public birth and marriage records. Once that apex ancestor is identified, the investigator reverses direction. They ruthlessly trace every single descendant forward through time, branch by branch, until they hit the present day. This is where your intuition completely betrays you. You assume tracking an anonymous phantom through millions of descendants would require a supercomputer and decades of processing time. It is a misconception born of Hollywood forensics. The reality is profoundly mundane. By mapping the genetic overlap in centimorgans, the algorithm forcefully eliminates 99% of the tree instantly. The suspect pool shrinks from infinity down to a handful of specific households. If you doubt the lethality of this dragnet, consider the peer-reviewed math. A landmark study published in the journal Science formalized this terrifying new reality. The researchers proved that a genomic database does not need to log every citizen to achieve total surveillance. If a platform captures a mere 2% of a target demographic, it crosses a terminal mathematical threshold. At that 2% saturation, you can successfully triangulate almost anyone.
We have already detonated that threshold.
By 2018, the open-source platform held around 1.5 million user profiles. That relatively tiny, seemingly harmless fraction of the public was enough to effectively identify 60% of all Americans of Northern European descent. 60%. More than half the population was suddenly caught in a biological crosshairs, stripped of their privacy without ever committing a crime or spitting into a tube.
The sheer elegance of this mathematical trap is staggering. We crowdsourced our own biological Panopticon, paying for the privilege with our credit cards. If this scale of accidental, inescapable surveillance blows your mind as much as it did the scientific community, hit the like button. And to ensure you do not miss the final, devastating solution to this forensic mystery, subscribe and leave a comment below. Do you think you could still hide from this algorithm? The official narrative insists this is a triumph of justice, a miracle of modern policing. But pull back the curtain on this glowing web of nodes. We are observing the total collapse of biological anonymity. Every time a distant relative uploads a raw data file to find a long-lost aunt, they are simultaneously registering you, your children, and your unborn grandchildren into a permanent, searchable police lineup. The consent of the individual has been mathematically overwritten. In a standard criminal investigation, you can burn your fingerprints, you can scrub your hard drives, and you can flee across international borders. But you cannot alter the centimorgans woven into your cellular structure. The investigator staring at the monitor in that cold case lab understood this structural vulnerability instantly. The Golden State Killer had left his genetic signature at the scene, unaware that decades later, his own bloodline would be weaponized against him. As the web of glowing nodes locked into place on the screen, the phantom was finally cornered. The open-source algorithm had successfully bridged the gap between a decades-old crime scene and a modern digital network. The pool of millions had been shattered, reduced by the cold logic of shared inheritance to a specific, manageable cluster of names. The abstract puzzle of centimorgans and distant cousins was rapidly materializing into physical, breathing suspects. But the genome can only take an investigation so far. Biology points to a family, a cluster of brothers, cousins, and uncles living parallel lives. To find the monster hiding within that perfectly normal American family tree, the investigators had to abandon the sleek world of genetic sequencing. They had to descend back into the analog dirt of the physical world, using the most archaic and mundane tools of the surveillance state to spring the final trap. Armed with a massive, sprawling family tree built from those public open-source hits, the investigators now had to prune the branches. The sleek, sterile world of genetic sequencing had done its job, but algorithms cannot make an arrest. The hunt had to descend back into the analog dirt of the physical world. The abstract puzzle of centimorgans was about to collide with the brutal reality of a stakeout.
Your favorite crime shows lied to you. They programmed you to believe that a DNA match prints out a single name and a glowing mugshot. The reality is far more counterintuitive. Genetics does not give you the killer. It gives you a stadium full of his cousins. To find the monster hiding within that perfectly normal American family tree, you use the most boring tools on Earth: census data, age brackets, and old phone books. Through the eyes of the forensic genealogist, the glowing monitors in that windowless lab transform into a chaotic web of demographics. Half the screen is buried in digital census records, faded military draft cards, and property deeds. On the other side of the country, an old man mows his lawn in a quiet California suburb, completely unaware that an invisible, bureaucratic noose is tightening around his neck. The genealogical tree had successfully bridged the gap from distant third cousins down to a specific set of great-grandparents. From that ancestral origin point, the genealogist traced every single branch forward to the present day. This painstaking reconstruction produced dozens of male descendants falling into the correct age range. It was no longer a biology problem, it was a logic puzzle. I have always found that this is where the official narrative of a high-tech victory crumbles into mundane reality. You have 50 suspects who share the exact same genetic architecture, the same ancestral markers, the same bloodline. How do you find the anomaly? You do not need a sequencer anymore. You need a librarian. You need the obsessive patience to dig through the paperwork of ordinary, forgotten lives. The investigators began systematically eliminating suspects using open-source intelligence. It is a cynical, subtractive process. You cross-reference the family tree against birth certificates, marriage licenses, and high school yearbooks. You track the movement of every male relative across the United States during the 1970s, looking for the geographic overlap with the crime scenes. The digital dragnet is merciless. The genealogist crossed off men who were stationed at military bases in different states when the attacks occurred. They eliminated suspects whose physical descriptions did not match the phenotypic predictions hidden within the DNA. If the genetic code mandated blue eyes and blonde hair, every brown-eyed cousin was immediately erased from the whiteboards in Sacramento. The suspect pool shrank with agonizing slowness. 50 men became 20. 20 became 12. The tension in that cold case lab was palpable, built on the silence of paper trails and the hum of dual monitors. Every ruled-out suspect brought the phantom closer to the light. The investigator is not looking for a killer. They are looking for the only ghost who cannot prove a geographical alibi. Look back at that split screen. On the left, the manic energy of detectives crossing off names, their eyes burning from exhaustion. On the right, the mundane tranquility of the California suburb. The man pushing the lawnmower is an artifact of a bygone era. He believes his past is buried beneath decades of silence, completely blind to the mathematical crosshairs locked onto his suburban home. The ruthless process of elimination finally sheared away the last false branches, leaving only one primary target standing. His name was Joseph James D'Angelo. He was not a criminal mastermind, nor a phantom. He was a former police officer. He had hidden in plain sight
protected by a badge and an utterly unremarkable life in the Sacramento suburbs, safe until a public algorithm betrayed him.
It is a paradox that shatters our understanding of security. The very system he swore to uphold, the bureaucracy he manipulated to evade capture for 40 years, was bypassed by a consumer product. But having a name on a sprawling genealogical chart is not enough for a conviction. You cannot arrest a man based on the saliva of his third cousin. You need direct, undeniable physical proof.
To confirm the match without tipping him off, the police had to navigate the remnants of the Fourth Amendment. They could not simply knock on his door and demand a cheek swab without a warrant. And a predictive family tree, no matter how mathematically sound, was unprecedented legal territory. The detectives had to wait for him to voluntarily abandon his genetic material in the public domain. Police covertly trailed D'Angelo through his quiet, predictable routine. The climax of this decades-long hunt was not a shootout or a high-speed chase. It was a stakeout, waiting for a trash run. Investigators secretly collected a discarded tissue from his trash can on the curb. That crumpled piece of paper contained the biological cryptographic key needed to unlock 40 years of terror. They rushed that discarded tissue back to the laboratory. The fresh cells scraped from a suburban trash can were sequenced and laid directly against the faded, degraded genetic profile extracted from that tiny vial in the Sacramento evidence room. The analog dirt of a crumpled napkin was finally translated into the digital language of a perfectly matched forensic matrix. The results confirmed a 100% genomic match. The statistical illusion vanished, replaced by the crushing reality of concrete evidence. The ghost had a name, an address, and a face. But as the handcuffs clicked around the wrists of a serial predator, a much larger, invisible trap snapped shut around the rest of us. The biological Panopticon was now fully operational. The news networks called it a miracle. Headlines flashed across every screen in America. Court gavels slammed, and the public exhaled a collective sigh of relief as a 40-year nightmare ended. But look past the celebratory press conferences. Through the eyes of the bioethics researcher, sitting in a cluttered university office buried under constitutional law textbooks, this victory looks entirely different. It looks like the deployment of a silent, invisible drone over every neighborhood. You watched the monster get locked away, and you felt safe. You were programmed to applaud the outcome without questioning the method. But here is the paradox that should keep you awake at night. Catching a serial predator is an undeniable triumph. But what happens when the exact same mathematical weapon is aimed at a teenager who shoplifted? The mechanism that trapped a killer does not distinguish between a massacre and a misdemeanor. It only calculates the probability of a match. The researcher stares through the rainy window of the campus office, tracing the implications. We just witnessed the most significant breach of civil liberties in modern history, packaged and sold as a true crime victory. The floodgates did not just open, they were entirely blown off their hinges. By cheering for the capture of one ghost, we implicitly validated a methodology that fundamentally breaks the social contract between the citizen and the surveillance capabilities of the state. The statistics from those initial months read less like police work and more like an industrial harvest. Within 2 years of the Golden State Killer's high-profile arrest, over 200 cold cases were abruptly closed using the exact same genetic genealogy technique. The investigative bottleneck was utterly shattered. Law enforcement suddenly possessed a skeleton key that fit every unsolved biological lock in the country, completely bypassing traditional forensic infrastructure.
You probably still believe the Fourth Amendment protects you. You think your biology is your sovereign territory, shielded against unreasonable search and seizure by the highest laws of the land. You are wrong. The legal reality is brutally simple. Constitutional protections only apply when you have a reasonable expectation of privacy. But the moment your biological code leaves your body, the courts consider it abandoned property. Your sovereignty effectively ends at your epidermis. This legal concept of abandonment was originally designed for a discarded murder weapon, not the microscopic dust of human existence. Legally, once you abandon your DNA by leaving dead skin cells on a coffee cup, or worse, when a distant relative voluntarily uploads their genetic data online, you automatically surrender your constitutional protections. You are not a citizen with rights. You are a leaking vessel of open-source data, scattering biometric evidence with every breath you take. The paradigm of policing shifted overnight. Police departments across the country realized a terrifying new truth. They no longer needed a judge, a warrant, or even probable cause to search your deep genetics. They only needed a reliable internet connection and an account on a public server. The arduous process of building a case was replaced by typing a string of code into a search bar. We traded the rigorous friction of due process for the terrifying frictionless speed of algorithms. But algorithmic speed breeds catastrophic errors. The bioethicist highlights a fatal flaw in the DNA dragnet. Genetics is not a sterile mathematical vacuum. It is a messy, physical reality prone to chaotic contamination. We treat a DNA match as the infallible word of God, an absolute binary of guilt or innocence. But what happens when the digital map of your genome collides with the analog chaos of the real world? The system inevitably begins to hallucinate suspects who were never there. The collateral damage was immediate and devastating. In one highly documented instance, an innocent man was falsely implicated in a brutal murder, his life momentarily destroyed by a supposedly flawless genetic match. His DNA was undeniably at the crime scene, but he was not the killer. His biological material was transferred to the victim by the paramedics who had treated him for an entirely different medical emergency hours earlier. The math was perfect, but the context was missing. This is the terrifying phenomenon known as secondary transfer. Your genetic signature can travel miles away from your physical body, carried on the gloves of a first responder or the fabric of a shared taxi seat. In a world where law enforcement scans massive familial databases for partial matches, a stray eyelash from a stranger can triangulate a SWAT team to your front door. The very sensitivity of the technology makes every citizen a latent suspect in crimes they never committed. I find it darkly comedic that we fear microchips and government wiretaps, yet we completely ignore the biological tracking beacon we shed everywhere we go. The shadow of the drone over the suburban neighborhood is no longer a metaphor for future dystopia. It is the current operational standard. We built a machine that treats human biology as a searchable index, and we handed the administration of that index to agencies absolutely desperate for quick closures and high conviction rates. And this is the core of the bioethics crisis. History proves that surveillance technologies never remain confined to their original extreme use cases. The wiretaps designed for the mafia inevitably drift down to low-level narcotics. The genetic triangulation justified by a serial killer will inevitably be weaponized against political dissidents, petty thieves, or anyone who crosses the state. The friction of cost and effort
was the only thing keeping the biological Panopticon in check.
That friction is completely gone now. We crossed the Rubicon the moment we let the ends justify the means.
But the ultimate dark irony is not just the behavior of the police. Law enforcement merely exploited the architecture that was already there. As the researcher shuffles through the dense stacks of terms of service agreements, the true beneficiary of this nightmare becomes clear. The government did not build the infrastructure of this new police state. A startup in Silicon Valley did.
The previous text ended on a chilling note. The infrastructure of this new police state wasn't built by the government, but by a Silicon Valley startup. As law enforcement rapidly exploited the open-source loophole, the architects of multi-billion-dollar commercial databases watched closely. They realized immediately that they were not just selling ancestry charts anymore. They were sitting on a vast, untapped goldmine of forensic power, and the state was a very motivated buyer. You were probably taught to fear an Orwellian future where a totalitarian regime forcefully extracts your biological data. That is a comforting, outdated myth. You thought the government was Big Brother, deploying fleets of agents to catalog your DNA. But Big Brother did not have the budget, the technical competence, or the legal authority for that. Instead, he just pulled out a corporate credit card and bought premium access from a friendly neighborhood startup. To the bioethics researcher observing this shift, the true horror unfolds not in a dark interrogation room, but behind the gleaming glass walls of a Silicon Valley headquarters. Below ground, acres of servers hum with the digitized biological essence of millions. Upstairs, in a sunlit boardroom, executives draft new contracts. This is the corporatization of human identity, rendered in sleek, modern aesthetics and legal jargon. The commodity being traded is you. Following the massive public revelation of the open-source loophole, the major commercial testing companies faced a PR nightmare. Their solution was brilliantly cynical. They hastily updated their terms of service, introducing a complex maze of checkboxes, forcing users to explicitly opt in or opt out of law enforcement matching. They packaged this as a triumph of consumer choice, a digital shield protecting your genetic privacy against government overreach. But let me burst that naive bubble. Do you actually read a 50-page legal document before clicking agree on a new app update? Of course not. The bioethics researcher knows this is a psychological exploit. By burying the consent clause deep within a dense wall of text, corporations secured the legal cover they needed while ensuring the vast majority of users remained completely oblivious to how their saliva was being weaponized by local police departments. And even that illusion of choice was a fragile facade. While some companies publicly postured about defending user privacy, others quietly opened the back door. A highly specialized genetics company called Family Tree DNA bypassed the public debate entirely. They secretly granted the Federal Bureau of Investigation routine, unhindered access to search their proprietary database. They essentially turned their servers into an annex of the federal government. This was not a minor breach. This database contained the deeply personal, mapped genetic blueprints of over 2 million unsuspecting users. When this covert partnership was finally exposed, the resulting outrage shook the bioethics community to its core. 2 million people had paid good money to discover their ethnic origins, completely unaware they were funding the construction of the most precise, inescapable federal dragnet in American history. Look at the sheer absurdity of this transaction. If the federal government demanded that 2 million citizens surrender a cheek swab for a permanent criminal database, it would trigger a constitutional crisis and riots in the streets.
But because a private corporation acted as the middleman, operating under the guise of consumer entertainment, the Fourth Amendment was neatly sidestepped. The government did not violate your rights. A corporation simply sold them. In 2019, attempting to quell the mounting public panic, the Department of Justice issued a set of interim guidelines. These rules were supposedly designed to tightly restrict the use of forensic genetic genealogy. The official narrative promised that this awesome power would be reserved strictly for the worst of the worst, unsolved violent felonies like serial murder and rape. It sounded like a reasonable, measured compromise to protect civil liberties. But here is the fatal flaw the researcher highlights in red ink. These are merely departmental policies, not codified laws. Policies can be rewritten on a Friday afternoon by an unelected bureaucrat with the stroke of a pen. There is zero permanent legislative barrier preventing this exact technology from being deployed tomorrow to track down a petty thief, a political protester, or an undocumented immigrant. The infrastructure is already built, waiting for a new directive. The researcher stares out at the rainy campus, the desk buried under constitutional law textbooks that suddenly feel utterly obsolete. The ink on those pages was designed to constrain the power of the state, but the founders never anticipated a world where the state simply outsources its tyranny. The hum of those Silicon Valley servers is the sound of a legal black hole devouring centuries of established jurisprudence regarding unlawful search and seizure. We have officially reached a paradigm where the most sensitive tracking apparatus ever conceived is owned by venture capitalists. We have completely outsourced the foundational infrastructure of a police state to private tech companies. By doing so, we have successfully bypassed every mechanism of democratic oversight. You cannot vote out a corporate board of directors, and you cannot easily subpoena the proprietary algorithms of a private, for-profit entity. This is the perfect crime against privacy, executed in broad daylight. The anomaly isn't just that your data is exposed, it is that the exposure is perfectly legal, bound by contracts you blindly accepted. The state doesn't need to break down your door to map your family lineage and pinpoint your location. They just need to serve a subpoena to a tech executive who already possesses the master key to your deeply personal, biological identity. You thought you were immune because you never committed a crime and never spat into a vial. I am telling you, your innocence is irrelevant to the algorithm. The corporate database does not distinguish between a serial killer and a curious citizen. It only sees nodes in a mathematically perfect web. The private sector successfully monetized your genetic code, and in the process, they permanently erased the boundary between the free citizen and the latent suspect. The bioethics researcher closes the dense legal file, exhausted by the sheer scale of the surrender. We walked blindly into this Panopticon, smiling and waving our credit cards, eager to discover if we were 5% Scandinavian. We financed our own perpetual surveillance. And as the corporate servers continued to hum, cross-referencing millions of lives per second, the trap snaps shut. The data is out there, and it can never, ever be retrieved. The screen in the lab goes dark, but outside the window, the sprawling American city is waking up to the night. Millions of lights flicker on in suburban homes, stretching toward the horizon. From above, this grid of illumination no longer looks like a map of concrete and steel. It looks exactly like the glowing nodes of the genetic family tree we just built. We watched the loophole open, become exploited, and get commercialized. Now we face the permanent reality it left behind. The detective closed his case file and the researcher abandoned her legal textbooks. Their roles in this story are over. The true subject of this final lesson is you. There is a fundamental axiom of biology you must now accept. There is no undoing this architecture. You can delete an app, change your passwords, or throw away your phone, but you cannot change your underlying source code. Most importantly, you cannot unspit into a plastic tube, nor can you force your relatives to retract theirs. We have crossed a mathematical event horizon. The era of biological anonymity is permanently over. Based on the relentless calculus of genetic genealogy, it is a statistical certainty that within the next decade, nearly every person of European descent in the United States will be instantly identifiable through third-party platforms. It does not matter if you personally opted out. Your privacy was never entirely yours to begin with. It is a shared biological asset, and your family spent it. Look closely at how this dragnet was constructed. We did not arrive at this inescapable surveillance state through the brutal decrees of a totalitarian dictator. There was no dystopian legislation forcing citizens to surrender their bodily fluids to the state. Instead, we built the ultimate Panopticon voluntarily, driven by a simple, innocent desire to know where we came from. We traded our fundamental right to biological obscurity for a colorful pie chart showing our ancestral origins. For decades, the scientific community treated the human genome as a profoundly private medical record. We assumed it was an intimate diary written in nucleotide bases, locked away inside the nucleus of your cells. That illusion has been entirely dispelled. Your genome is now a globally networked tracking device. It is a biological serial number that broadcasts your exact location in the human family tree, and you carry it into every room you enter, shedding it on every coffee cup you touch. Joseph James DeAngelo, the phantom who terrorized California for decades, was finally captured because he left a microscopic piece of himself behind at his crime scenes. He thought his anonymity was absolute, right up until the handcuffs locked around his wrists. But today, the horrifying truth is that we have all left a piece of ourselves behind. By uploading our familial data to unregulated servers, we have quietly uploaded our constitutional freedom directly into the corporate cloud. This is the final verdict of our investigation. We began by looking at the FBI, relying on 20 miserable markers of junk DNA, staring blindly at cold cases. We watched as they bypassed their legal constraints by tapping into the 600,000 data points you willingly gave to venture capitalists. The state did not need to defeat the Fourth Amendment in a court of law. They simply walked around it, using an open-source bridge constructed by amateur genealogists in their living rooms. The mathematics of identity by descent is a beautiful, terrifying concept. It proves that human beings are deeply tethered to one another through invisible threads of centimorgans. But in the hands of the state, that profound biological unity has been weaponized into a snare. When a database requires only a 2% participation rate to unmask an entire population, individuality ceases to exist. You are no longer a singular citizen, you are simply a data point waiting to be triangulated. Consider the collateral damage of this frictionless search capability. We already witnessed innocent people falsely accused of murder because their DNA was accidentally transferred by paramedics. When the state can search millions of citizens without probable cause, without a warrant, and without oversight, errors are not just anomalies. They are systemic inevitabilities. We replaced the careful, methodical burden of proof
with the cold, unforgiving output of an unregulated matching algorithm. This brings us to the most chilling conclusion of our curriculum. The infrastructure of the modern police state is not owned by the government. It is owned by Silicon Valley. The interim guidelines issued by the Department of Justice are nothing more than fragile policies waiting to be rewritten the moment a new crisis demands it. We outsourced our civil liberties to private entities whose primary fiduciary duty is to their shareholders, not to the preservation of your constitutional rights.
Your homework, as you navigate this newly mapped reality, is to recognize the true cost of convenience. Every time a new technological miracle is offered in exchange for your personal data, you must ask yourself what invisible prison you are helping to construct. The Golden State loophole was never just about catching one monster in Sacramento. It was a stress test on the fabric of a free society, and it proved precisely how eager we are to dismantle our own sanctuaries for a momentary thrill. If this investigation has shattered your perspective on privacy, hit the like button. That is how we know we are delivering the intellectual rigor you demand. Go into the comments and record your final verdict on whether the capture of one serial killer was worth the permanent surrender of our biological anonymity. And if you want to continue dissecting the unseen forces that govern our reality, subscribe to this channel. The case on genetic genealogy is closed, but our research never stops. You are left living in a glass house built entirely of your own genetic material. The lights of the city continue to burn, each one representing a life that is perfectly indexed, permanently searchable, and entirely exposed to the dark. We surrendered the deepest secrets of our bloodline, and the algorithm is patiently waiting for your turn in the spotlight. Now you know the undeniable truth of the modern era. Live with it. Class dismissed.